on to actually developing the schedule. So developing the schedule, we use a Tumla technique called network schedule analysis. And remember I told you PMI's favorite word is analysis or analyze, right? Double check, measure twice, cut once type deal, right? We're building a rocket ship. Well, if we look at develop schedule, analyzes all schedule data created by processes, identify activities or define activities, 6-3 sequence activities, and then estimate activity durations. It takes all of those and it makes a comprehensive final schedule model and schedule baseline. And so by analyzing, it says, go back through and check all of your relationships, your dependencies, your lags, your estimates, you know, check at the basis of those estimates, make sure it's all good. Now that you have the sequence together, come up with the schedule. So that's what we're doing here. But we're going to come up with with 4 distinct outputs here, right? So we'll get this schedule baseline. This is the schedule that we give the customer or management. This is what gets signed off on. Then you have the project schedule. That's the detailed schedule that you would use with your team. All right, so 2 different things here. So think about this. When we give our clients or our customer schedule, we usually give them like a milestone schedule or like a Gantt chart or something like that. They're not very much interested in like, you know, which activity starts before which and, you know, on this day and the resource. So we don't give them that detailed schedule. So those are 2 different outputs for PMI. Keep that in mind. Schedule baseline gets signed off on. Project schedule is just a project document. We can change that as we see fit, right? We can implore leads and lags. We may have delays, et cetera, that don't require us to get sign off from management, right? So the schedule is a different document. We'll get the data, we'll get the calendars of when project work is gonna happen. So those are gonna be the 4 distinct outputs we'll see in this process. Right, so the schedule baseline is that approved version. All right, you wanna highlight that. Again, it's what gets signed off on. Has to be approved by your sponsor. Gives you your start and end dates. And it's how you can look at variance. Right, you can only change the baseline using change control. Meaning you got to go back to the sponsor and tell them, give them some form of analysis so that they can determine if they're going to change it. All right, so this is one of the triple constraints. You get the project schedule. This has all the activities, shows all which activities, you know, lead up to which milestones. Usually shows, you know, who may be doing those activities, what the start date and end date of each activities are. Right? All that information is usually found in the project schedule, a very detailed project schedule that we keep. There's common methods here, whether it's a bar chart, milestone chart, schedule, Gantt charts. You know, there's many different ways to do it. I mean, heck, an Excel spreadsheet, you know, it's still widely used. You know, you can create your schedule that way. So. All right, here's some bar charts, sort of a graphical picture of this. You're not going to be required to memorize pictures of these. Like PMI doesn't, on their exam, they don't give you pictures and then ask what this chart or this diagram is. However, they describe them. So that's why you see them on the screen, right? They do you one better. They describe it, and now you've got to be able to see it in your head. All right, so a bar chart and a Gantt chart are the same thing for PMI. Right, anything that just has activities and little lines and takes you through. Okay. Milestone charts, summaries, summary schedule, sometimes we call it that, but it just shows those key dates. All right, here's your actual schedule, the schedule network diagram. So when we first created this, in sequence activities, we didn't have the relationships. We didn't have any dependencies. We didn't have, you know, any estimates. All we had was a schedule network diagram. Now we have the project schedule network diagram that has all of this additional information in it. So I just want to highlight the fact that they sound the same, but 2 different things. When we sequence activities, we get a schedule network diagram. And then when we develop the schedule, we get a project schedule network diagram. Okay, schedule data is another output that we get from PMI, and schedule data is just all the information that we've acquired to date. This would be all of the activity attributes, the folks that are going to be doing it, the duration estimates, the basis of those estimates, and we didn't look at 3-point estimating using standard deviations. We're going to look at it using cost, but you may have a 1, 2, 3 standard deviation variation of your schedule, right? You may have all of your estimates using 3-point estimates, all right, using beta or PERT, and then using the standard deviation, you can have a confidence interval of 68.26 or 95.46 or 99.73. You could have 3 variations of the schedule. That's where you see those alternate schedules there, right? So that's what schedule data is for PMI. And then the project calendar. The project calendar is just the days that work is happening on the project. And so work could be happening on the project 365 days of the year, including, federal holidays. However, there's a resource calendar where there's certain folks who are only available on these days and machines that are only available so many hours at a time, et cetera, et cetera. So the project calendar shows when work is happening on the project, this regardless of resource. Right, we would have used our schedule management plan to create those outputs to sort of govern the how, and that would have told us like which documents we were going to be working with and which tools and which data sets and what software, etc. We would take the scope baseline obviously into account because the scope statement is going to say how we're doing the work. The WBS would have had the deliverables that we need to complete, and all these activities should be rolling up to complete those deliverables. And the WBS dictionary would describe it. So we would have taken that into account as well. All right. Now, as we develop it, now we're talking about the tools and techniques, right? So how would we have done this? All right. Well, it is iterative. We wouldn't have done it all at once, right? If I go back one slide, at the bottom, we see here that the schedule model incorporates outputs from risk, schedule, integration, resource management. We haven't gotten to those processes yet. So we're going to come back and update this schedule. We're going to come back and do this a few more times. All right, we'll do it once, one big process formally. We're probably going to come back and do this a few times. All right, so as these tools and techniques we'll use, we'll do schedule network analysis. Analysis, double check, measure twice, cut once. All right, so we're going to go back and then we're going to look through all of the activities, how they're related to each other, how they're dependent upon each other. And we're going to make sure that they're all right. And we're going to do a forward and backwards pass. And then we're going to figure out what the critical path of the project is. We're going to do it by hand. And so most of you use critical path scheduling, all of you? Yeah, okay. So you just have to learn how to do it by hand for the exam. That's what we're going to do here. All right, so these are the different things we're going to look at that PMI needs you to know. We'll do critical path. I'm going to show you how to do it by hand. We'll talk about the resource optimization techniques, right? Leveling and smoothing. We'll look at what if scenario analysis. We could simulate using Monte Carlo, if you guys are familiar with that. And then schedule compression techniques. We can fast track and we can crash. So we're going to deep dive into each of those. All right, so critical path is all about figuring out, it's funny because it is the longest path, but it's actually the quickest that you can complete your project given no hiccups, right? That's actually the quickest you could actually do the project is the critical path. So it's the longest duration of activities throughout your project, all right? Least amount of float, normally 0. Right now, I say least amount because yes, when you first do this, you better get 0 float when you very first do it, or else your math is wrong, right? And you'll see because we have to set the early finish equal to the late finish and then work backwards. So you got to have 0, but as you're running your project, it's very common to have the critical path have some float, right? So just whichever one has the least amount of float. Now let me ask you guys this, because you're creating schedules from scratch, so you always get a 0 float. And on the projects where you're retained throughout, I mean, do you see that your critical path consistently have float?
Yeah, I would say that in the majority of the projects that I work on, they're probably a little bit different than what Chris would say from a design perspective, but most of my work is planning. So we build in a lot of float and have that luxury. For instance, we'll pad the schedule quite a bit based on what we think it'll take, just because there's so many uncertainties associated with scheduling workshops and getting people all, getting everybody's schedule in sync so that we can hold a key milestone delivery workshop or meeting.
Right.
So almost every task we have has extra padding and float built in. So critical path is usually has plenty of float for us to be able to move around with. So I don't know if I'd call it zero float. I think there's a little bit of float in each and every task, the work that I do.
Okay. Yeah, we are talking. We're almost talking the same thing here, because PMI is going to be very specific, because what you're referring to as float, Ryan, PMI is going to call that buffer. You build in buffer time.
Okay. Yeah.
So CJ, on the construction side, sometimes we'll have like contract documents that say, hey, you get a certain amount of days due to delay in weather.
Okay.
So would that be construed as float because I'm extending the schedule due to an unforeseen, or how does that work?
No, that's contingency.
That's
a contingency reserve. So they've reserved a number of days for you to use due to weather. They've looked at, the historical weather patterns, did, analysis, probability impact, and said 17 days is likely, what could happen. And so they allow you to build that in the schedule. That's a reserve. We could call that a buffer only if they build it into the schedule. If that 17 days is added to the schedule, so the final product is 17 days later, then
that's what happens.
Then
that's what happens.
We padded or we buffered the schedule. If we keep the schedule here, we say that, the schedule has the delivery date here, but we know that if we use all of our buffer, it would end out here. But as of right now, this is what the schedule, we're tracking to this, and we know that we have reserve to use, then that's contingency. So that's the difference between the two. If you have an end date here, but then you have this piece here, they call that reserve for the total thing. But if your total project includes it and it's within each of the activities, then that's padding or buffer. And there's no right or wrong way from PMI. They're going to be very specific about those terms, because you can use them all in different ways. So float is going to be specific to either two activities, a chain of activities, or the project itself, right? So float is going to be about, think a chain of activities. And like if I have a chain with links, right? And if I put it together, it's more taut, right? I have float there. But if I start pulling it and then it gets more taut and it gets tighter and tighter, that's zero float. So that's what we're going to talk about here.
And that's all dependent on whether you have start to finish, finish to start dependencies, correct? How that float can be calculated.
Correct, because the critical path usually has a sequence of activities that will have mandatory dependencies, and those mandatory usually have, finish to start or finish to start or finish to finish sort of a relationship. So there is free float and total float. There's also project float, right? It says two types of float exist here. Let me add one that PMI will talk about, which is a project float. Right, so let's jump into all of these, right? So critical path. Here's your activity node, and this is sort of like your legend. This is a legend here. So as we go through, and we're going to create these things here, right? Each of these nodes here, here's the legend. So let me go back and let's look at the legend, right? So you're going to have the name of the activity. Usually this is like a letter, a number or a letter, like activity A, activity B, C, D, so on and so forth, okay? All right, so we're gonna have the early start in column 1, right? If it's one activity, 10 activities, whatever it is in column 1, the early start of this activity will be 1. Like this is column 2, column 3, column 4. The early start will always be 1. So we'll know what this number is. We'll know what the duration is. These numbers will all be filled out because we would have already gotten that. We've already estimated the durations, right? And so we'll take the start plus a duration, we'll subtract 1, and we'll get the early finish. And we'll do that for all of these activities going across the top, All right, we'll figure out all the early start and all the early finish activities. Then we're going to finish that. We're going to set the late finish equal to this early finish, and then we're going to work backwards. And we're going to subtract the duration from this late finish and get a late start, and then do a backwards pass. And we'll get all the bottom numbers going backwards. And then once we do that, then we'll be able to figure out what the float is, because we'll subtract the late finish from the early finish, and then we'll fill in the float values for all of these activities. And then we'll simply just find the path that has the least amount of float. But when we very first start, we should get one that has 0 float. All right, so we got the legend here, early start, early finish. We'll find these numbers, the durations are given. We'll set the last activity, we'll set the late finish equal to the early finish, and we'll find all these numbers. And then when we figure all the numbers out, then we'll find the float for each one. And then after that, we'll go back and figure out what the critical path is. So, all right. So activity A, they give you the relationship, they give you the duration, the dependency. So we have all these durations that we can put in because we see them there. The dependencies are there and the relationships are complete. So now let's do the forward and backwards pass. Okay. So, whoops. Okay. Can I go back again? No, it just puts them in. Okay, so when we do the forward pass, right, we'll start 0 plus 1 is 1. Right? And now that we've done, so there's sort of two ways. There's 0-day methodology and there's day 1 methodology. All right. This is day 0 methodology. There's a day 1 methodology. I believe PMI will test you on both. So this slide is going to show you day 0, and then I'll also teach you day 1. All right, so there's 0 day and day 1. Are you guys familiar with that? With the two, Dana, you are with 0 day. Chris, are you familiar with 0 day and day 1? With both?
Means that
Are you
that one to me?
Are you familiar with both 0 day
No.
0? Nothing.
No, it's just the day you start.
Okay. So here's day 0. Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do early start plus duration, and we'll get the early finish. Now that we're done with this column, right? There's only one activity, so we're done. Now we're gonna do the forward pass. And we're gonna go to this column, we'll get to the first activity, and we're gonna look back and we're gonna say, how many predecessor activities do we have? Well, B only has 1, and it's A. So therefore, 1 is the largest number, and we put it there. Same thing with C. It's the only A is the only predecessor. D is the only predecessor. So now that 1 becomes there. Now 1 plus 3 is 4. 1 plus 2 is 3. 1 plus 5 is 6. All right. You just add it straight across. Now when we get to E, well, you only have 1 predecessor activity, which was B. So we transfer the 4. When we get to F, F had 2 predecessors, both C and D. D was the larger number. Since F can't start until both C and D are done, and D is the bigger number, then obviously we've got to wait till D is done. So we use the 6 here. G also has 2, all right? Or excuse me, no, only has 1, which is just D, so it's 6. And then we go 4 plus 4 is 8, 6 and 5 is 11, 6 and 3 is 9. And now that we're done with this column, we need to do the forward pass again. And we need to pass to the next one. So H. How many predecessors does activity H have? 1, is it 2? Just 1? I see 2. I see 2, but what's interesting, well, no,
I see
don't.
1.
I'm sorry, it is just 1.
E. Yeah, just E, right?
The larger one, so it's E. Activity I, you have 2, and you have the 8 and the 11, but we take the 11, it's the larger number. And in activity J, we have 1, which is G, and so we take the 9. And you just keep going straight across. Activity K, all 3, all right, are predecessors. Therefore, we got to take the largest number, which is J, and that's 16. So we put the 16 there. 16 plus 4 is 20.
Mhm.
Now we got all the top numbers. Now the reason why the critical path, longest chain of activities, least amount of float, normally 0, because when we do this for the first time, we got to get 0 because we're about to set the late finish equal to the early finish. We're gonna make this number also 20, and we're gonna work backwards. And somewhere, because we're working backwards with the same number, we should get a path of 0. All right, so the numbers have to work out. So let's now do the backwards pass. And what we do is we start at the last activity, and we set the late finish equal to the early finish. We see that there. So now it becomes 20. And then now we do late finish minus duration, and that equals the late start. So 20 minus 4, there we go. Now we got to do a backwards pass. When we do the backwards pass, you look at this activity and you say, how many successors did it have? Well, it only had 1. Therefore, we take the 16. Each of these only had 1 successor activity. So we take the 16, and then we do 16 minus 4, minus 2, minus 7, and you get your 3 figures. We're done with this column, and we're going to do the backwards pass. So we get to activity E, and activity E looks like has 2 numbers here, 14 and a 12. It's going to take the smallest number, which is the 12. Activity F only had 1, 14. Activity G only had 1, which is J. So we take the 9, and we do the same thing. Right? So again, when we do the backwards pass, we take the smaller number. Right? Right here only 1 predecessor, but in here, right, I only have 1. When I get to D, I have 2. I have 9 and I have G, so I get to take the smaller number, which is 6. So just remember, when we do the forward pass, we take the bigger number. When we do the backwards pass, we take the smaller number. Whatever those, if an activity has multiple relationships and dependencies. Okay, so we do it all the way back. 8 minus 3, 9 minus 2, 6 minus 5. We get our 3 figures. And then now we get to take the smallest number, right? Because activity A, all 3 of these are successors. So we get to take the smallest number, and then 1 minus 1 is 0. Now, do we see the critical path? Maybe not yet. We don't see it yet, right? Now we got to find it by finding float. We got to take the late finish minus the early finish, and we'll find the float. So we do 20 minus 20, 16 minus 12. You got 16 minus 13, 16 minus 16. Or you can take the late start minus the early start. 6 minus 6, 9 minus 6, 8 minus 4, 5 minus 1, right? And you did it all the way back. Now that we've done that, do we see the critical path? And it's highlighted there. We just follow the path with 0 float. So when you're taking the exam, the way that these questions will be presented, let me see. I'm just gonna, all right, so we have a case study here. And they give you some here. So let me show you, I'm gonna give you how these questions would be presented on the exam. Let me come back to that page where I float. Your question would read something like this. Activity A is a predecessor to activity B, C, and D. Activity F is a successor of activity C and D. Activity E is dependent upon activity B. Activity G is a predecessor of activity J. Activity E is a predecessor of both H and I. And activity I is dependent upon F. Activity K is dependent upon H, I, and J. Right, so you're reading and that's what it'll say. And then it'll say A equals 1, B equals 3, C equals 2, D equals 5, E equals 4, so on and so forth. It'll be in a paragraph just like that. And then it'll ask you a question like, what is the float of activity C? So now you'll have to actually, on your scratch paper, based on reading those dependencies, draw out the boxes, put the numbers in, so you can see how just that one question might take you 2 or 3 minutes to do.
So CJ, in this diagram you have drawn, question you just asked, what is the float of C? Is that the answer 6? in there? Is that where the float ends up being?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yes. So you'll have to like remember one of these in your head and on the, so what happens is not only all the formulas and the processes, but any other stuff like this, you remember it in your head. And on the day of the exam, the first 10 to 15 minutes, you get 2 sheets of scratch paper. You literally, you write down all the processes, you write down all the formulas, you make this chart and this diagram. Because when you get to question 140, you're not going to remember that present value equals future value divided by 1 plus the interest rate to the nth period. All right? You're not just remember these formulas in your head. You're going to be tired, your eyes like staring at a screen. So we make what we call a brain dump, because the word cheat sheet doesn't sound proper, but you know, it's a practice that's been used for years. PMI knows about it because they actually collect everyone's scratch paper at the end. You're only allowed to get 2, so you have to give up like a sheet to get a sheet type deal. So they know that people do this, but that is a technique for passing this exam, is that you will literally memorize this stuff so that you reproduce sort of a chart, you know, a cheat sheet literally, you know, and then you go take the exam and you just refer to all of these things. So like that formula, pessimistic plus 4 times most likely plus optimistic divided by 6, you'll have to remember that enough to at least write it down, you know, and you're going to practice writing it down over the course of your studies, and that's how you'll be able to do this. But I also want to mention this. This is also the idea that you may only get 2 of these questions on the exam. 1 question, 1 point. Mark this for review and come back to the end. So maybe you don't even get to these 2. So what? You'll still pass the exam, right? So your job is to pass the exam. Your job is not to answer every question correctly. You will fail if you try to answer every question correctly, because it'll just take too much time. And that's their goal, because as project managers, we deal with ambiguous information and we deal with time constraints. And so they put you under those same conditions in the exam. So just understand that. You could literally delay all network schedule diagram questions to the end. And let's say you get 15. You're like, well, I can't just not do 15. All right, well, now that you've done 1 and you do a second, you do a third, you're going to get faster at creating these diagrams simply by doing the same type of question over and over. You'll actually get quicker versus doing 1 here, 1 there, 1 here, 1 there. So that's another strategy of this exam, you know, where you get this great opportunity to mark questions for review, to leave them blank, or to mark it for review and leave it blank. And now you can use this, take me to all the questions I've left blank, or take me to all the questions that I marked for review, and use that so that it jumps back and forth for you for certain questions. All right, so now with that being said, that's the forward and backwards pass. You find float, and now we found the critical path. All right, now the practical application of this, I will tell you in my experience, because project does this for us, you know, P6 does this for us, is when you're working with a team that doesn't quite respect the work per se, or they don't value the how delicate of a balance the relationships and dependencies have between activities, you take a chunk of work or 1 small deliverable. You know, like this might just be 1 tiny deliverable, right? You would take that and you would actually do it by hand with them, right? In a, you know, in whiteboard session or something like that, with a 5 or 10 minute session. And when people see this and they see the complexity and they understand what it takes, all of a sudden they respect it a little bit more, and you get a little bit better performance out of it. So you need to know this for the exam. In our real world, we don't do it by hand, right? So I just wanted to pay forward, like in my experience, what I was taught, that's how I use it, and it's actually worked, you know, in those times that I've needed to. But when I don't need it to, I mean, you rarely get into calculating critical path by hand, right? But you're going to need to know how to do it for the exam. All right, the other part about the exam is that now that we've created this schedule, right, now we got to go back, because we're doing scheduled network analysis, we're double checking and measuring twice. We got to go back and make sure that, you know, we haven't underutilized or over allocated resources, right? And so there's 2 ways to do this. 1 is leveling and 1 is smoothing, right? So what I want you to remember for the exam is that leveling does not care about the schedule, right? It will push the schedule. Okay? And smoothing will not. And most of you use projects, so you're familiar with leveling and smoothing, I'm assuming? Yes, no? Okay. No, okay, so we're gonna, for the exam, I'm gonna show you some pictures of it. Let me see if, yeah, I'm gonna show you some pictures of leveling and smoothing in a second, but I want you to write this down because literally for the exam, that's all you have to remember. If they're describing a scenario where your resources are impacting the baseline and it's going to change it, we're talking about leveling, right? And if we're describing a scenario where we're thinking about it, but we're like, well, we can't, this deadline's hard, it's a hard deadline, there's nothing that we can do, and we're trying to figure it out, then we're talking about smoothing. So here's leveling. Leveling and smoothing. Leveling will push out the schedule. So here's the idea. We had some project and, you know, we have these in whatever period, right? These are weeks. So in week 1, we need a resource that looks like 10 hours. In week 2, 16 hours a day. Week 3, so on and so forth, right? And then we turn around and find out that maybe this is, oh, we got to use union labor. We can't go over 8 hours. All right, so now what leveling will first do is it will look at all of these activities that are above your line, whatever line you set. We set our line level to 8. It will first look to level up. Let me stop here because PMI is going to test you on this because normally we're leveling down. Rarely do we level up. So of course, exam is going to want to test you on this. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have a resource who's testing 2 hours a day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and you decide, you know what? Let's just have this resource test 8 hours a day on Friday. You have leveled up that person to 1 8-hour day a week instead of 4 2-hour days a week, right? So it will first look to level up. So that's what we see here. That's what we see here. We're leveling up in periods 4 and 5. And then after that, it will take and push out, you know, equal periods for as much time as you have left until, you know, you may have one little small bar here left, but it'll do that. Now, it doesn't mean it will push your deadline. Let's say our deadline was in period 15 and we thought we were going to get done in 7 and we leveled it and we got it done in 10. Okay, well, fine. But what it means by it will push out the schedule is that leveling by theory does not care what the schedule is. If you have a hard level for a resource, whatever it is, it's going to set it up and it will push the schedule out, right? It just may. All right, now smoothing, it will not. Smoothing will not let the schedule slip. All right, we see this hard deadline here, and that's why we have this question mark over these activities. This is commonly like testing or heavy machinery that, you know, that can only be utilized at a certain time. And so now it's heavily utilized here. And so we look at some of these activities and we say, if you remember the dependencies, some of these activities, these discretionary activities, can we switch the order from them? Can we do some of this work up front? If not, well, then folks are just going to have to work 24 hours or 2 12-hour overtimes or 3 rolling 8-hour shifts. All right, something like that. But smoothing will not let the schedule slip. So that's the difference between the two. So that's leveling and smoothing. Leveling will let the schedule slip, smoothing will not. All right. And then when we develop the schedule and we look at this, we'll use these what-if scenario analysis. This is another way to do it, right? Another way to develop the schedule. That's probably the most common way. We just don't sit down and say, we're going to do the what-if scenario analysis, right? We don't sit down and do that, but we will say, well, what if we use John instead of Larry? What if we use Sheila? You know, what if we got a senior person? What if we outsource this? You know, that's what the what-if scenario analysis is. So, all right, it's pretty straightforward. You'll see that on the exam. And then simulation. This is where we run Monte Carlo. If you're not familiar with Monte Carlo, it's tens of thousands of simulations. This is, you know, they'll use Monte Carlo for the drying times of concrete. You know, huge applications. We'll use you know where you see it? The Weather Channel, right? You're watching the Weather Channel and you're seeing, hey, we've got this hurricane coming down the Panhandle, you know, Florida, coming into the Gulf Coast. And so what they're doing, you're seeing the simulation of the data in colors: orange, green, yellow, red. And they're taking the almanac and all of this data, historical data and weather patterns and current patterns and air pressures and all this stuff, right? Water in the air. And then they're using it to simulate likely what is this hurricane going to look like? Where is it going to land? Where is it going to travel, et cetera, et cetera. So that's Monte Carlo. You can do the same thing with your schedule. Now we haven't talked about the beta or PERT yet, so you haven't seen the full standard deviation set, but that's where this may come in, and you'll run simulations to get a schedules that come within 1, 2, 3 standard deviations. And then we'll use that to provide levels of confidence to our folks, right? I'm gonna give you a 68% level of confidence schedule, a 95 and a 99. And that's the idea there. All right, so that's the simulation. And then there's scenarios where we need to make the project, happen sooner than we otherwise thought we needed to, right? So we can crash or we can fast track. What you need to remember for the exam is that crashing will increase risk. Will increase your cost, but there's no risk. Whereas fast tracking, it will increase your risk, but there's no additional cost. Okay? Crashing is costly, but there's no risk. Fast tracking is risky, but there's no cost. Okay, so let me, let's say, all right. So we got a project, and our project is to make the best dry erase markers. I didn't even know that's the brand I have. That's pretty sweet. Have the name Best Dry Erase Markers, right? Okay. So we got to make the mold. We got to make a cap. We have some felt and we got some ink, right? So we make a mold for the body. We make a mold for the cap. We pour our compound in the mold and it dries. We pour our compound for the cap, it dries. And we say, okay, we test the cap to the body. We say, okay, just the right amount of pressure. So we'll mass produce the bodies. We'll produce like maybe another 1,000 of these, right? And then we'll take the head and we'll test it and they all work. Okay, great. And then we'll mass produce the heads and they all work. Okay, great. Then we put the felt and the ink and that's our production system, right? Okay. So if we were to crash it, let's say we needed to make our pins quickly than we needed to, then what we simply would do is we might run 3 production lines, right? We'll still make the molds for the body, molds for the cap, pour the compound in, pour it in, test it, it works. Then instead of 1 production line of the bodies, we might have 2 production lines. Well, if a run of 100,000 is what we're going for, if I do 2 runs of 50,000, I'm going to spend more money doing that, right? The shorter the runs, right? You gain, efficiencies and cost reductions at scale. So it's going to cost me more money to dedicate resources, right? To do 2 runs so I get it done in a short amount of time. Then I'll test my caps. Then I'll do 2, maybe 4 production runs of caps so that they do quickly. I'll test it, but I did it all in sequence. So I didn't add any risk, but it cost me more money to use resources quicker. Fast tracking says this, well, you made the mold for the body, mold for the cap, you poured the compound, you tested it, it all worked good. Why don't you just produce the bodies and the caps at the same time? It's not going to cost you any more money. You were already going to pay for one production run of bodies. You're going to pay for 1 production run of caps. Just do them at the same time. It doesn't cost you any more money. However, it's risky because what happens if, well, this works now, but what we didn't realize is that 24 hours from now, that this compound shrinks, 0.03 of an inch, and now it's just too tight. It's too tight, and the user experience is too bad, and then people don't want to buy the caps. So now we've got to either melt all these down and rework them, or even worse, scrap them and use new material and create a new one. So that's the idea of fast tracking being risky just because you're doing activities out of order. So that's how PMI will describe it on the exam. They're going to describe that you're doing stuff, and they're going to talk about risk, and then turn around and ask you a schedule question, right? And how would you, as a project manager, adjust your schedule, right? And according to that, you're going to have to choose crashing or fast tracking. So
CJ, real quick question on the bottom right corner of the fast tracking boxes there. You've got a finish to start relationship. How can you push that start ahead of the finish in the first box if it's a finish to start relationship?
Yeah, and it just may be that you can't fast track, it may be, you can't really, you're not really going to be able to fast track that other than there may be a set time or a dry time, kind of like, all right, I can't build the cabinetry until, we pour the concrete, but I needed to wait 3 days for the concrete to dry. But I didn't. I started building the cabinetry like a day later, right? That's the idea of sort of a fast track. That's risky. All right, what happens if we get some unevenness or fissures or, Does that make sense?
It does.
But typically in the actual, like this is exam, like theoretical world, like in a practical application, you can more fast track. It's more difficult to fast track activities with that type of relationship unless you have scenarios that I gave you. So you're right, but for the exam, they're just going to be very. Each question will have its own life too. So don't get to a point where you're reading a question and you start thinking, well, what about this and what about that? Because that's what they want you to do, right? If it doesn't say it in the question, then it doesn't exist. So remember that for the exam too. As a standardized exam for PMI, if it doesn't say it, don't start, don't make anything up in your head. Even though that's not what you're talking about, I just want to mention that. Okay, so case study, and we'll take a break. Good, okay. All right, so mute yourselves. Let's see, in example A, schedule
Crashing.
technique.
Crashing.
Okay. What did the team use in B?
Fast tracking.
Okay. And then what is the largest impact of crashing that John has to evaluate and account for?
Cost impact.
Good.
B.
Good.
This is rework.
If he chose fast tracking, what would the answer be here?
A.
Good. The impact of product quality. We're doing things out of order, right? We don't have testing time, etc.